Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third and the last day of the Budapest Water Summit. Today we will continue to listen to various interesting topics, starting from implementation through transboundary cooperation to institutional architecture. Please note that in the afternoon we will have the closing session, where you'll have the pleasure to hear from His Excellency Mr. Péter Szijjártó, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also our own András Szörösi Nagy will join us on stage. For now, we will talk about implementation. Do we have the right system at place? Moderated by Mr. Ravi Narayanan, Chair of the Governing Council of the Asia-Pacific Forum and member of the International Program and Drafting Committee of the Summit. May I kindly ask the moderator and also the keynote speakers to join me up on stage. Ravi will ask the panel members to join us a bit later. Enjoy the discussion.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session number 8 on this beautiful, crisp October day here in Budapest. This session is about, as you can see, for implementation, do we have the right systems in place? It's an intriguing title and sometimes ambiguous because it depends on what you mean by systems. So classically, you would say systems is connected to institutions, policies and laws and methods and processes. But before that, we need to take some account of what could be called a theory of change. Well, the theory of change, as borne out by, shall we say, the currents of history, is that development and growth and progress depend on 3 pillars. One is on systems, which could be institutions, policies, and methods, but also on science and technology, and, of course, capacity, both institutional and human. One could say, couldn't one, that it's a bit like a 3-stage rocket. The 3-stage development rocket has the first stage as of science and technology as the enabler, the second stage systems, the organizer, and third capacity, the deliverer. Now, this is a complex scenario, and in order to help us navigate through these complexities and arrive at a destination, we have a distinguished set of speakers, the keynote speaker and the panelists, whom I'll introduce one by one. The keynote speaker will be delivered by Claudia Paul-Vosti, who is the Director, Institute of Environmental Systems Research at the University of Osnabrück in Germany. But she will be preceded by Mr. Tebaldo Vinciguerra, who from the Dicastery for Promotion of Integrated Human Development, the Holy See, and he will deliver a message from His Holiness the Pope. So we are starting off in an enlightened way, and I hope that the proceedings will follow suit. The panelists themselves are a very distinguished and experienced lot. We have His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Abdel Ati, the Minister for Water Resources and Irrigation of the Arab Republic of Egypt. We have Mr. Eddie Moores, the Rector of the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, whom I'm sure all of you know. Monsieur Jean Launay, President of the National Water Committee and French Water Partnership of France, but he is also a former Member of Parliament from France. and then Mr. Stefano Berci, Executive Chairman, International Association of Water Law, previously at the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. So we have a distinguished panelist. So the way we're going to proceed is there will be a message from the Pope, which will be read out, followed by the keynote, and then the panelists will be invited on stage. And the reason why they're sitting among the audience now is because they're not able to, if they sit on the stage, they will not be able to see the slides of the presentation. So in order to give them the benefit and have a richer debate, this is the system. I hope that's agreeable to all of you. Okay? I take silence as an assent. Thank you very much. Now, it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Vinci Guerra to deliver the Pope's address.
To His Excellency János Adar, President of the Republic of Hungary, His Holiness Pope Francis sends prayerful best wishes to Your Excellency and to the distinguished government representatives and delegates of international organizations attending the Budapest Water Summit taking place from 15 to 17 October 2019. As the summit explores the theme of preventing water crisis, His Holiness trusts that the basic human right to safe and clean water will guide its deliberations. For indeed, our world has a grave social debt towards the poor who lack access to drinking water, because they are denied the right to a life consistent with their inalienable dignity. Conscious of the pressing needs of so many of our brothers and sisters, His Holiness likewise hopes that the most marginalized members of the human family will be the first to benefit from improvements in sustainable supplies of the most cherished gift of water. With these sentiments, the Holy Father cordially invokes upon all assembled in Budapest God's abundant blessings. Signed, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State.
That was a good start and an inspiring start to the session. Please note the word human rights. We'll come back to it in a second. Not in a second, but during the course of this session. Now may I invite Claudia Palvosti, who will give us the keynote address. Claudia, the floor is yours.
So, morning, and obviously I feel very honored to have provided my keynote after the blessing from the Pope, and he highlighted that we deal with a very important topic. And my own contribution, I have chosen the session of the title of the session, implementation. I want to focus, do we have the right governance systems in place? And we have heard already yesterday quite a bit about contributions of science and technology and engineering, and I would like to highlight today really the contribution of the social sciences to understand this complex fabric of governance systems and understand also and improve them, because there's quite a bit what we can do. What Rabbi also said, systems have various pillars and they are a bit ambiguous. It should be the role of science to clarify more how to go about here. And when we have this question about do we have the right systems in place, disentangling these questions means how to determine if these systems are right. So for whom, for who would, what might be right for one person might be right, not right for others. Second, assuming that otherwise we might not pose these questions, if the systems in place are not the right ones, is it more attributed to fundamental flaws in policy design, or rather, do we really have much more problems in terms of implementation processes, implementation gaps? And I will show you that probably the latter is the case. So in terms of if we talk about do we have the right governance systems in place, if we look at persistence governance failures, persistence governance crisis, more than a decade, everyone argues that, or many, it has come much more to the center stage, that water crisis is a governance crisis. And still, many governance gaps persist, coordination gaps, vertical and horizontal across levels, but also sectors, administrative units. We have a lot of implementation gaps, I'll highlight those, advanced regulatory frameworks, but implementation deficits, poor capacity to respond really to change, to learn. That is something that what I call not triple loop learning is a bit more an approach to understanding change, not really transforming, but more doing, let's say, the wrong thing better. I would say just diverting rivers is probably not the best thing to deal with water scarcity. One might first check whether probably land use systems or also the irrigation systems in place are the most efficient ones. So also this was an insight from the IWM target for SDG 651, that is one of the SDGs is focusing directly the indicator on IWM implementation. We already heard that it's off target. Major bottlenecks is implementation, and in particular implementation gaps at subnational level. Engagement of other sectors, that is a continuous problem that we deal with in the water field, coordination across level, that for some this vertical coordination, but also to support collective action and stakeholder implementation process. That's because the current process of reporting, and probably not only 651, doesn't necessarily a diagnostic approach. I'll explain soon what this means, and really transformative change. In order to move from really identifying gaps and finding the appropriate means together with stakeholders to deal with them. So there is also scope for improvement. An example for a country that really highlights this very well, that what you have on paper may not be in practice, is South Africa. Just to highlight, I don't want to say that South Africa is the only example where you find these gaps, but I flag this out since we have a very long tradition since many years to collaborative research with South African partners, and that is really, and as I said, it's a very instrumental example. We have on one hand an excellent and innovative IWM legislation, the South African National Water Act. It had been developed in a broad stakeholder process. It includes the human right to water. It has an ecological reserve. It has catchment management agencies, was also introduced, 17 at the beginning. There were many stakeholders involved in designing it, so really it was highlighted as one of the best examples, progressive examples of water legislation. However, we have major implementation problems. The number of these catchment management agencies was reduced from 17 to 9, and last year, when we had our stakeholder meeting, a workshop in the basins we work, where there was a governmental cassette to reduce it to 1 CMA for the whole country. So that is a bit strange. That has changed again. We might have heard the new South African water minister, who really seems to be more committed to really improve. However, there is resource problems, financial, technical expertise is lacking. And the report in 2017, for example, highlighted huge problems at the Department of Water and Sanitation. 900 positions were not filled, so a capacity gap, but also a lot of investment wasn't really clear where it ended up to. So a strong legacy for a new government, a new minister, to really, and that will not be fast to improve this. But I think this is a situation one might find also quite representative also of other countries. And one of the challenges that was highlighted by a lady who was also involved here initially in designing this Water Act, the Volkswagen versus the Rolls-Royce issue, is the most advanced legislation the best to really that you want to implement? Shouldn't you perhaps, as has the implementation process shown, develop something that rather implement something more simple, but that is implementable? And really, initially during the implementation, really getting the basics right, And also, really, one of the key issues, more inclusive participatory processes, not only during consultation. Some of the lessons to be learned from this example. And this kind of example, you just try to summarize a whole range of challenges that we identified from, you see from a lot of comparative analysis from diverse river basin governance systems. No panaceas, but more general guiding principles. Good practices for implementation. You still have to be able to tailor practices to context. And what we also show quite often, regulatory frameworks are necessary, but by no means sufficient. Institutional capacity is more important in order really to implement effective systems. Another point was the economic development needs to be complemented by institutional development to lead to improvement. For example, in our comparative analysis, the biggest explanatory factor, the strongest we could find for governance failure, had been what we call the effectiveness of formal institutions. We measured by the corruption perception index. So just pumping in money in a system where you don't have appropriate governance processes in place will not be very help much. And we also seen, and I would really highlight what Clement Hockner said yesterday, often economic development leads to fulfilling needs of human population, but to much lesser extent to the environment, which in the long will also fire back to really the human development. Another point, that more polycentric governance, which means you have a distribution of responsibility, part coordination, and innovative ways for dealing with uncertainty, had been a key element to deal with much of the challenges of fast-changing environments, climate change we face today. So these are some of the principles we've detected, but the governance capacity to deal with persistent pressing challenges is quite low in many countries, not only in developing countries. I say, we also have, for example, in my country, Germany, we are not excellently dealing with all water issues. There are also quite a few problems we face there. And the question is how to improve and move to what we call a diagnostic approach. So I want to give you some insights from ongoing research to really show how you can tackle this issue, to understand do we have the right systems, or which systems do we have in place, and moving from looking at these systems to prioritizing where there are strengths and weaknesses to really supporting transformative change. Some insights from a research program that's also linked to this, supported by the Sustainable Water Future program. So this around we developed this diagnostic approach, and we often talk about can you transfer insights from one stage to the other, but then we want to analyze under which conditions can you transfer successes or failures from one case to the other, and really elaborate on strategies for transformative change. In particular, also support the implementation of the SDGs here, in particular SDG 651. We closely collaborate here with the implementation process. So what is panaceas versus diagnosis? There has been a strong or long tradition, in particular in the water field, to emphasize panaceas, the one-size-fits-all recipes. Privatization, water user associations that have been, sometimes when you look at the policies of some countries that in terms of just in developing world, you just could see the latest fashion on what had been the preferred recipe that was just followed. Also centralized wastewater treatment, that's not a governance recipe, but in principle it's a system design recipe, you could say. That has been applied everywhere without considering, is it appropriate? Does it meet the kind of path, the capacities of a country, and often also without following up whether once implemented it had really been successful or not. So now what you have, what we move much more to, and also people like Ellen Ostrom, for example, has promoted very strongly this, or in Young, more diagnostic approach, which takes into account the complexity of social ecological systems in a more systematic fashion, trying to understand the systems, and support context-sensitive, not context-dependent. Analysis that is sensitive to context in order to see, all right, what can be transferred and where do we have to take the context into account to be able to transfer insights among similar classes of problems and contexts. A bit comparable to this medical diagnosis. So just, I have here my own water supply, so I'm really very... Because otherwise, having glasses here might result in accidents, so there's certain instability. So that's it. Thank you very much. I have this. Good. So that's a very nice service. Okay, let's continue here. So I shouldn't fall dry when I talk about water issues, dealing with the water crisis. So that was quite an easy thing to deal with an individual water crisis, very well solved. Now, analyzing governance and management systems and their performance. So just to give you an idea how this could work and what we are doing in this project, on one hand, I think to try to capture this ambiguity and complexity, we have a strong focus on really looking at implementation and the processes themselves. You have on one hand the process level, processes of planning, implementation here, really focus on implementation of measures, and what we call ecosystem service interactions, direct interaction with the resource. But these processes are embedded in the governance structure, rules, power constellation, and they are embedded in an overall context, societal, environmental. And for example, if you really want to understand, does coordination, is it present or not? One of our foci is coordination is, all right, do we have, for example, coordination instruments that are there on paper in rules? Second, are they implemented? What are the kind of processes that we have where coordination may happen? Often you find quite a bit of efforts, roundtables, God knows what, where in principle coordination could take place. However, does it translate to outcomes? Do you really have a change in land use practices, for example, based on water availability? So does it translate to outcomes? And finally, can we assume or see already that this translates to impacts, for example, reducing ecosystem services trade-offs? Having such a more structured approach is really helping to identify the bottlenecks and also set priorities. And we have a couple of in-depth cases to study this, but we broaden it at a large database to include more experiences from many countries. But just to flag out a few of the problems that we tackle, for example, also in Germany. We have two cases in Germany, for example, where my university is located. One of the problems there is really coordination between agriculture and water, energy, food nexus. And we heard from Clement Hockner about problems with the Paris Agreement on hydrology, in our case, on hydropower and ecosystems. In our case, the renewable energy law resulted in a huge boom of maize production. So in our area, we have intensive livestock production. We had some cooperation between farmers and water producers, drinking water supplies already, to reduce the nitrate entering groundwater. Then we had the renewable energy law, which provided huge subsidies. We had an explosion of maize production. So the maize that is produced in this country, in our area, ends up in producing electricity, renewable electricity. All our fodder for this intensive livestock production comes from Brazil, for example. Everything, all the nutrients end up in the groundwater, later in the rivers in the North Sea. And we are currently, Germany has even a court case with the European Commission not complying with the nitrate directive. So we note that also here, in a country like Germany, where you have quite efficient governance systems in place, things are not always working as expected or as they should. We have also success examples like the Weser-Emscher, which is one of the most polluted rivers, due to really innovative coordination approaches, really managed to restore this river, but also sometimes this really has to deal with a holistic management with governance fragmentation. Mongolia, where we have more mining issues, we have now quite another project that came in from Iran, where you have obviously not an easy governance situation. Guadalquivir in Spain, we have much more water scarcity, and as I said, one of our major cases is also in South Africa, the Umgeni, where we have seen that part of the lacking governance capacity has been partly people have taken up and built their own initiatives. So a lot of bottom-up initiatives could be observed, where they try to somehow deal with the void that we have seen before has been generated by this looming expectation of a CMA to be implemented, a catchment management agency, but that never came. So a whole range of various experiences, and in the end, what we try to do here in order to provide more general insights what works or not. Just some insights from this first analysis, like this polycentric governance and synergistic interplay of governance modes supports coordination. What do I mean here? synergistic interplay, very often we have these different kinds of instruments, like market-based instruments, then you have voluntary approaches, you have government regulation. And one of the key things is how to mix them in an appropriate way in order to really tailor it to the current level of the processes, but also tailor it to the context. And this kind of synergistic interplay, and often we have conflicts between the various instruments that are implemented. That is a big issue. Policy incoherence is another point, that what I just mentioned as an example in Germany. If you have perverse subsidies provided by one sector, that you have a big problem in the water sector to deal with the corresponding consequences. Then we also looked what we call misfit between ecosystem service interactions and coordination processes leads to sustainability deficits. What do I mean there? Often you have, that is this whole water energy food nexus approach, for example, you have interaction via ecosystem services that by providing food, for example, you interfere with a whole other range of ecosystem services. And this is not appropriately covered by coordination instruments, so the interdependencies in the ecosystems don't find their correspondence in processes in the governance system to deal with those. That is an issue that can be a strong diagnostic approach. Do we have the right structures and processes in place? And one of the key things is implementation capacity is essential for effective coordination, effective governance. And we have some influence of context. So we have resource availability, power constellation, in particular also corruption, accountability, transparency. Quite a few of the good governance principles are key in order to really build implementation capacity. And that is also related to this interplay between formal and informal institutions. They can be detrimental, would say corruption, overriding, or these kind of structures, the form regulation is detrimental. They can be very beneficial if you really engage bottom-up initiatives, stakeholder involvement, together with regulatory framework to really move towards transformative change. But it's important to get it right. So implementation, do we have the right systems in place? My answer is not really. And I would rather say we should pose another question, namely, or shift it a bit, implementation, how to design effective and flexible governance processes. Move away from this design of the ideal frameworks to really how to design the right processes to get there. And to summarize, so how to overcome the implementation gap, I think we need a more emphasis on processes of transformation and change that need be tailored to context rather than these idealized blueprints for governance solutions. Like, as I pointed out, just looking at IWM plans, if they are implemented somewhere, if they are somewhere in the drawers of a government, doesn't tell you very much whether they are really appropriate to deal or if they are implemented and deal with the governance problems. And that's why we need to have much stronger focus on implementation and quality of governance processes. Really, do they comply with good governance principles? Identification of leverage points and change agents. That is a key issue to really support transformative change. More transdisciplinary research, which means that really we try to practice this as much as possible, where really research is done in close exchange with implementation processes. So much policy implementation is ongoing. I think there's much more opportunity to really capitalize on those, include it or build it to research processes that we can move further with this a diagnostic approach and transformative change. And finally, really to establish a global community of practice that would also be linked to the SDG implementation process. That's something we have been discussing since some time. I'm already at the moment in discussion with the OECD governance initiative. There is experience there or processes here. Just joining forces in order to really a community of practice would mean that research, governments, and also implementation experiences on the ground would join in a community of practice, really sharing experiences and see moving further this diagnostic approach, encouraging also governments to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses and see, right, how can they capitalize in order to learn from each other, in order really to move that perhaps in the next Budapest Water Summit we say, right, the systems are not entirely right yet, but hopefully they have improved. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia. That was a very, very comprehensive sweep of the issues. And we'll come back to some of those complexities that you have talked about. But in the meantime, can I invite the panelists to come on stage, please? You can come in through there. We'll start the panel discussion in a minute. Can you all hear clearly? Good. Thank you very much. Because on stage we can't hear very well. Isn't that an irony? It's a bit like, do we have the right systems in place? No. So. Yeah, sure. Monsieur. So, you know, this title, do we have the right systems in place, can be followed up by another set of questions. For what? Right systems for what? For whom? And where? Because many things, as Claudia's presentation has pointed out, depend on context. So it's entirely appropriate, therefore, that we have the first panelist, His Excellency Mr. Muhammad Abdulati, who is the Honorable Minister for Irrigation and Water Resources in the Republic of Egypt. And to him, I'll ask a question on his challenges. Yesterday, or day before yesterday, the Indian minister talked about river valley civilizations. Well, Egypt is the first and original river valley civilization. And sir, when you have a thread of water going through the middle of a country with desert on either side, and the challenges of depending on the river for human well-being, for food, and for navigation and for general development, how robust and how have you organized your systems to meet the challenges, particularly we talk about climate change and the uncertainty about the future? So could we have some idea about how you're organizing yourself to meet these challenges, sir?
Thank you. Good morning. In fact, as you correctly said, that Egypt is a desert that's crossed by the Nile. And it is a closed system, controlled at the border with Sudan with High Aswan Dam, and at the outlet to the Mediterranean by 2 barrages that prevent water from flowing to the sea. Of course, this have some, environmental impact, but as far as it is a closed system and the available water is limited and the vulnerability of the country to climate change is very high, especially in the delta and the heat waves that we are facing, as well as any development upstream could affect our system unless it is coordinated development. So what we do actually, before the construction of High Aswan Dam, our system was based on managing floods. And at the same time, during droughts, we face severe issues related to droughts. Now, with the population increase and with the climate change impacts, we are converting our system to deal with drought, managing scarcity. And this is vital for us. Managing scarcity requires different kind of training, different kind of capacity, and as well as strong participation from the users, different water users and stakeholders. The vulnerability to climate change makes the delta vulnerable to that, and we are doing major works for protecting deltas that have a lot of costs on the economy. To deal with these challenges, we have set the Egyptian strategy for water management that have 4 pillars. The first pillar is water quality, because our system is mainly based on recycling water several times, and we use water with salinity up to 5,000 ppm to be mixed, remixed, and reused again and again several times. This brings our water use efficiency actually one of the highest. In the same time, it is vital for us to deal with water quality. It is the highest priority in our strategy in the country. The second priority is water use efficiency. Though our efficiency, global efficiency, is high because of recycling, I think that we are one of the biggest country or the highest country in the world who is recycling water. We are recycling about more than 33% of our renewable water resources. And this is relatively high, so the quality of this recycling water is a priority. Otherwise, it will be a threat for us if we are not able to bring the needed amount of water to deal with our system. Water use efficiency, we are dealing with introduction of modern irrigation in all the lands, as well as enhancing the farmers' income. The ways that we are dealing with it to involve the farmers themselves. So we tell them how to do it, and then they get engaged in implementing this modern irrigation, as well as in managing water. So we allocate water at the canals, and through the Water Users Association, they do coordinate with themselves in managing this amount of water to fulfill their needs, water needs. The third pillar is water resources development, and we are dealing with water because our population increase and our water demand is increasing. So the government of Egypt have set a strategy since 2016, that a strategic decision that all the development along the Mediterranean and the Red Sea will be based on desalination. And this is another challenge. I would put an example. 3 years ago, our production of desalinated water was 80,000 cubic meter per day. Now it is 800,000. So it's almost double, 10 times. In few years, we are planning by 2030, our desalinated water will be 3 million per day, cubic meter. The fourth pillar is enabling environment, of course, as far as we are changing our system into another system. So public awareness is part of enabling environment, telling the facts to the public, as well as capacity development. And this is vital because our engineers and technicians and the farmers also need to change from, water availability into water scarcity, and this requires different ways of managing water. Also, governance. As Claudia mentioned, water governance is high priority for us to implement all these strategies and all these pillars. Water governance, we have introduced a new water law to the parliament, where water users will have a bigger role in managing water, as well as dealing with different water-related issues and the climate change issues, as well as allocating water according to the status of the climate and the status of the water availability. Of course, these broad pillars need to have a sort of implementation mechanism. The implementation mechanism, we have the National Water Resources Plan 2017-2037, that would require investment, financial requirements more than $50 billion. This is an optimistic figure, but I do believe that this figure is, subject to be doubled with the increasing demand on water. Of course, this is a challenge. How do we allocate the right resources? How do we fulfill the needed technical staff? As far as we are, the turnover in our technical staff is high. They gain the experience, and then they get attracted by other countries to transfer this experience. Of course, this put a lot of pressure in our water management. Adding to that, the coordination with the upstream countries, and in this respect, I would mention the GERD, the Ethiopian dam. Unless there is an agreement on the filling and operation of the dam, coordinated with High Aswan Dam, I think this will be another big challenge for our water resources. By this, I think I'd like to commit to the set time schedule, and we can elaborate later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, when you're talking about recycling, big investment in recycling, how has that been received by the people? Was there general acceptance? Did you have to have a campaign beforehand to get them to accept recycled water? Or was it quite an easy process?
Actually, recycling, we have two types of recycling. The first recycling is the drainage, agriculture drainage water. And this is wherever you irrigate, the excess water gets to the drains, and the drains we bring back through pumping the drainage water into the system. And this, with this, I mean, kind of recycling is accepted by the farmers because we are practicing it for, 30 years, the last 30 years. The other type of recycling is treated sewage water, and this is not accepted by some of the communities, and this requires more effort to convince the communities that this is, important for us as far as we guarantee the quality. The quality is controlled by different other auditing bodies, not the Ministry of Water Resources, to give assurance to the public that the quality of water is suitable for reuse for irrigation wherever it is needed.
Thank you. Okay, so that we have so many more questions to ask, but it's a fascinating story of a live and developing story. Because as you said, sir, it's not the end of the story because more investment has been needed. Further challenges lie ahead of us. From Egypt, we move to France, where Monsieur Jean Launay will tell us a little bit about the French experience of developing institutions and water systems, and crucially, its applicability to other contexts. It's okay to doing it in France. How applicable are those same principles and practices elsewhere? Monsieur Launay.
Thank you. Good morning. My English is not good enough, and it's possible that Maggie White helped me. For many years, France has had a strong water policy based on major principles: public responsibility, technical and financial management by catchment area, participation of the stakeholders and co-construction, project management on a local level, and decentralization. Three big types of players are in charge in France of French legislation and policy for water management. The government, and you say I am the president of Water National Committee, which depends of the Ministry of Ecology. Basin level bodies, there are 6 in France, local decision makers and project managers. Hydrological basins are delimited by the watersheds of surface water. As basin level, a committee develops a water development and management master plan. In French, we say SDAGE. The water agencies in mainland France and the water offices in overseas territories provide financial support for the implementation of these master plans. Depending on local context, local water commissions can develop local version of this master plan. In France, we say SAGE. They aim to reconcile different water uses with the protection of wetlands and aquatic environments within a specific catchment area. J'ajoute.
I'd like to add that the geographic coverage of this in France is not total, and there's some weaknesses that have been actually identified during a national process of consultation that took place in France in 2018 and 2019 when it comes to the water cycle. And I was the coordinator of that process, the national coordinator of that process.
Another important thing to know about the French system to water management is that it has evolved over time. We started with the management of drinking water in the 18th century. Today, our system also manages the restoration of waterways, flood prevention, biodiversity, preservation and climate change adaptation, some of today's biggest challenges.
And on that point, the scientific analysis of the IPCC actually show that we need to change our modalities of how we adapt when it comes to water issues, since it's one of the major ways in which climate change is manifested.
Thank you. So do we have, you heard the Egyptian minister, do you have a sense that there is some similarity in approach in developing the systems for water security? Do you have a feeling that there is some similarity?
The major tools of French water policy are transferable and adaptable to other contexts around the world. Here are a few examples of such tools. Basin level planning, taxes, which are collected from users by water agencies and redistributed at basin level in the form of aid to improve drinking water networks, combat pollution, and protect the aquatic environment.
And actually, the water tariffs place more than water. The interventions of the water basin agencies actually invest a lot into biodiversity and climate change issues.
We can also speak from social pricing of water, which provided access to water for all at a reasonable price, a common water information system to collect and share data on water and aquatic environment, the environmental police to ensure regulations are respected, co-construction with users and the public on the management of water resources, a strategy for adapting to the climate emergency in every basin. All these tools are key levers for implementing the water targets of the L'Agenda 2030 and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. I now turn to Stefano Burci. Stefano, one of the things yesterday we heard about the fact that we live in a divided world. And poverty is a big issue, large parts of Africa and Asia. Given that, and in the struggle to turn policy as intention to policy as practice, what role does a legal framework have in delivering that promise? Particularly, as I said, in countries where capacity is poor, and as Claudia said, systems are weak, and so on. And, it's a layered process. So can you throw some light on that?
Thank you, Ravi. Does this work? Yes. First of all, my deep gratitude to the organizers for being invited to join this distinguished panel and this discussion. Now, you posit the $5 million question, essentially. So the law in itself, the legal system in itself, will not address and solve, such a monumental problem, an issue as you describe, as you posited. However, Claudia in her presentation did allude a number of times to the regulatory frameworks, to the legal framework as part of the governance system, because any governance system, to my mind, has to be underpinned by a legal, a legal framework, regulatory framework, which is, how could I say, which does not impede, but rather facilitate the challenges ahead. And the challenges which are exacerbated by climate variability, with the impacts that such context may have, in particular on the poorer segments of the population and of the water users groups that you allude to. Now, in fact, in much contemporary water law thinking and practice, as I observe, from my observation point, from personal experience, but also research, That is one of the critical issues that contemporary water laws try to address in a variety of manners, i.e., how to account for and bring in the fold of formal legislation those who are or tend to be left behind, the poorer, segments of the population, of the water user population. So that is one of the single biggest challenges that you see reflected and answered in the more progressive and advanced contemporary water laws. Now, Claudia used a term that caught my imagination. She said, when she alluded to the legal system, she said regulatory frameworks, she said advanced regulatory framework. You used that word. Well, to my mind and from observation, I would say that that is one feature of the more advanced regulatory frameworks for water resources management. How to bring in the fold and how to account for the myriad small, teeny users on the ground, the poorer, segments of the water user population. And as I said, and I insist, contemporary water laws, the more recent generation of water laws, do try and provide an answer to that. For instance, think of Peru, Ecuador, recent water laws adopted in those countries where there are large segments of especially traditional populations that live by their own customs. South Africa is another good example of that. So you have examples of how laws try to address, contemporary water laws try to address this issue. Now, this being said, implementation is a different story. Delivering on the promise, delivering on the mechanisms that the more recent generation of water laws provide for is a different story. And I'll be happy to address that, but maybe we can carry on the conversation with the other members of the panel first.
Are there two sources of, is this operating? Can you hear me? Are there two sources of confusion? One is reference to human rights. Is it more confusing or enlightening? That's number one. And the second one is, do you think, given the volumetric use of water, about 80% is used for agriculture, that the attention that is generally paid to water and sanitation sometimes overshadows the importance of water for food, which is about 80% of the volumetric use of water. So two things.
So on the human right to water, it is true that, how would I say, it zooms in on a fraction of total water use in terms of quantitative terms. But in terms of, politically speaking, the human right to water is a fundamental issue that has a lot of visibility and that in fact you see attended to and catered for, again, in contemporary water laws, where you have very often you have a human right to water enshrined in the law itself. Then again, delivering is a different story, but at least you see that now enshrined more often than not as a principle, as a policy principle, and as an obligation of government as well, not just, a policy principle per se. Now, and that is enshrining the human right to water primarily for drinking purposes in the law is one way of addressing the larger issue that you had mentioned, at the outset. So accounting for the needs and the requirements of the poorer segments of the population. But then, that goes beyond. In contemporary thinking, now there is a tendency to move beyond and past just the human right to water for drinking alone, and moving on to the human right to water for subsistence, livelihoods, for livelihood purposes. And now you move a bit away from that very narrow, teeny, segment that the human right to water for drinking alone, caters for or accounts for. But in answer to your second question, yes, there might be, a risk of overshadowing by focusing, zooming in on that particular segment of, the user population and on that particular issue as reflected in contemporary legislation. There is a risk of overshadowing, the larger picture of that 80% of water use that goes for agriculture, as we know, in a large part of the world. And to my mind, that there is no clear-cut answer to the issue, if you like, so long as there are proper mechanisms in the water laws to regulate and address the larger segment of water use and the water user population, but also not to leave behind, the smaller segment, the drinking water segment. When it comes to regulating the two, now, if I may add, one should bear in mind that there is a clear separation and distinction at regulation between service delivery and resource management. So the human right to water has the dual connotation of service delivery and resource use as well. But service delivery is the province of separate, legislation, separate regulation, whereas water management tends to be, a different kettle of fish altogether.
Eddie, I now turn to you. Now, as the head of an institution that is renowned internationally in the whole world of water management, and in the context of the issue that Claudia brought up about capacity challenges, is it a struggle to try and introduce this idea of, in the curriculum and in the education system, of the importance of institutional development and an emphasis on soft skills, negotiation, communication, etc. Hard skills we can all understand, hard engineering skills and so on. But is this a struggle, and is there some way in which we can overcome this?
Thank you, Rafi. And first of all, I would also like, I think it was the last seat of Claudia's conclusion was no, so that's on implementation. So I fully agree, and I think also what we just heard from the different speakers here is that if you're working with water, and you're now opening a bottle here, which is drinking water, so I don't know for sure if that's your human right, but I think the issues are quite complex there as well. So what we see is, as an institute, we started in 1957, mainly on engineering purposes to prevent flooding. And if you look how it has been developing in the past, we see that there is more and more need and interest as well. One, actually, to have an interdisciplinary approach, which is a starting point. But I think in the educational systems, we are still struggling quite a lot in really having an interdisciplinary approach. And then even this step further, what Claudia also was mentioning, is about transdisciplinarity. So that's where you also make the connection actually with policymakers, but also with other water users that I think is required. If you want to make that step, then for sure you need those soft skills as well. And another important part in there is that as an institute, we don't believe in just delivering a course for a student. We believe in lifelong learning process. And what we see is that our students in their lifetime, they start maybe as a technician somewhere, but in the end they become a manager or they become Ministry of Water Resources. And in that path towards this development, you see that you will require and you need more and more soft skills. And we have seen that happening already over the years, but we also see that that process goes much faster. And I think what you also heard from some of the explanations here is that if you are a water manager or if you are a manager of a water services facility, you have to talk with other people. You have to start thinking about other users. And because also of the scarcity of water, it's quite important that you also integrate and interact with other sectors. So it's also about health, it's about energy. Food is a very important part in there. And I think in that sense, you need to know how to communicate with others, but also how you can sit at the negotiation table. And as an example there is what we try to do, for example, in transboundary related issues. Sometimes the technical issues can be a solution, so you need those technical skills as well. But at the same time, you also need to be able to interact actually with the other people at the table. You need to know something about the regulations and how you can imply that. You need to know something also about the needs and how people work. You need to know something about the culture. Religion is quite important as well, to appreciate how people have different perspectives actually on the value of water before you can come to a sort of agreement. So I fully think it's needed. And I think maybe also to support Claudia in what she concluded is that we're, for the last 30 years, every 5 years, we organize a conference to look at how the capacity development is, say, taking a new path and what you can learn from that. We will organize a new seminar next year in May. And there, as a title, we have, should we go towards implementation science? And I think that already indicates that we have big questions, actually, what we should do if we really want to make a step forward that is more leapfrogging than continuing in the way what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a question to our representative of the Holy See, which might sound slightly odd, but Tibaldo, we've been talking about issues like training and capacity building and infrastructure and so on. But when you talk about human rights, is there something that is missing? Is there a moral imperative that we don't emphasize enough? The idea of our responsibility to our neighbor? A moral argument that is often missing in everything that we do. Are we too functional? Are we too instrumental rather than enough of the inner voice?
Certainly, we should be aware of the humiliating situation of mankind. We are not here in a summit about should we use smartphone instead of tablets. It's about some 2 billion people having problems with access to drinking water. 2 billion people having some problem with sanitation. And in the last 3 years, the UN worked a lot on problems of wash in healthcare facilities. So you are poor, you are sick, you go to the hospital and there is a water problem. And we heard in the last 2 days that many poor countries poor in water, nevertheless manage to have good standards. We mentioned Las Vegas, Jordania, but we still have these 2 billion of brothers and sisters. And the daunting question remains, why should I care? Why should I care? Then I like your question about moral. Maybe that the good system, the good governance, has a moral purpose. What is the good? What is the meaningful life? What is the flourishing of mankind we would like? Remember the years 2012, 2013. UN adopted a resolution, the General Assembly, explaining that GDP is not an indicator for happiness and well-being. So they felt the need to adopt a resolution describing GDP as an inadequate indicator. What goals, what targets, what purpose are all our governance system pursuing? Let me quote the teaching from Pope Paul VI. We are in the 60s and in the 70s, and he gave as a moral compass the so-called integral human development, which is the development of the whole humankind, so all the persons, all the groups, the development of all the generations, but also the development of the whole human person, well-being, culture, economics, spirituality, bioethics, civil life, political life, whatever. So a rich goal. This should be the purpose of a right system, pursuing this kind of integral, meaningful life for the whole society. And how can you sustain it? 3 pillars: education, spirituality, and culture. The first day, the Minister of India, he mentioned ancient Veda text and the presence of spirituality in the Gange River, sacred river. Honorable Minister of Egypt, if I remember correctly some of my old textbook, Nile was more or less a god in ancient Egypt. We have some Muslim colleagues in this room. I talked yesterday with them, oh yes, the Quran and water in the Quran. Maybe there is some kind of wisdom, how important was water, and how important was even at that time the management of water. Maybe from a past wisdom, we can recover the strength and the purpose to future action. Somehow, we should also acknowledge this comment of Pope Francis when he described in his letter Laudato Si, 2015 encyclical letter Laudato Si, we have one crisis, socio-economic crisis, but, and this is a very strong paragraph of that letter, we still lack the culture to face that crisis. Be careful. We may have the technology, some institutions, some laws, but overall, we still lack the culture to face that crisis. This is why, let's say, this idea of culture, spirituality, and education is so important. Why should I care? What is my vision of brothers and sisters? What is my vision about water? The Pope, in his message, described it as a gift. It is entrusted to us, but it will be entrusted to the others. So maybe it's not only about what kind of planet we will entrust to future generations, so how many water, how many trees, how many crude oil, no. But also what kind of future generations, what kind of son we will leave in this planet. And this means what kind of education, what kind of democracy, what kind of laws. And when, distinguished colleagues, you mention inclusive process is not mere consultation. On a weekly basis, we hear this in the dicastery. So the dicastery is one of the ministries supporting the work of the Pope in the Vatican. This is so strong. So maybe if we have the good goal, the right basis, the right culture, then hopefully, in this integral, holistic vision, all the pieces will start to fix in the proper way, and hopefully, religions can play a role because water is so important. Maybe genuine religious value may give us a small answer, but nevertheless important to why I should care, why I should respect my brothers, my sisters, and water. And so interreligious cooperation in this field can be really meaningful, not only for taking care of water, but I think even for peace.
Thank you. So we're introducing a new dimension that is not compliance, but empathy, which is something that we're sometimes a bit embarrassed to talk about, but I suppose it's there at the back of each of us, our intentions. Claudia, if I may just turn to you for a second. One of the earlier principles in one of your earlier slides was the importance of participation. Now, hazards and possibilities of that. Is the process of participation more art than science?
Prior to answering your question, I just would also just allude to what has been said before from the Pope delegate. I entirely support your arguments on spirituality, because one of the most, I would say, the game changer that I've seen more recently was also the role of First Nations and their spirituality they bring into the place. For example, I've been working quite a bit in Canada, where really, on one hand, really there was and I would highlight it's not only about brothers and sisters, other humans, but you mentioned the Ganga, brothers and sisters nature. So they bring in a very new approach to understanding human nature and human nature relationships. So that is positive, but also they have been quite successful because these regulations, these laws are enshrined in laws. And they went to court. The Supreme Court has really changed water legislation, water governance, not only environmental governance, quite a bit in Canada. So on one hand, I think we have we have here, I think the ethical argument needs to be strong, and also with ecosystem, understanding the role of ecosystems. On the other hand, one has also seen there are a lot of power structures in this world, and we have to just be aware that sometimes we have also to be realistic to overcome those. On one hand, yes, having ethical arguments, but for example, when you talk about ecosystem services, it can't harm to have also a functional approach to highlight that in the long run, it for example, will undermine the whole fabric of how we deal, for example, with the landscape, that in the long run, we will just not sustain the base for life. So I think we need probably both in order to strengthen the two kinds of arguments. So coming back to participation, is it art or more science? I think there are some general applicable principles that you can engage in participation in terms of exclusiveness, try to overcome power structures, empowerment, but you can also try to say what are good design principles for how to include participation. So I would say on one hand, it has a component where you can implement design principles, but it has also, what I wouldn't say art, perhaps it's also a craft. One shouldn't underestimate the technical skills that are required to really implement good participation processes. What I see far too often, that relates also to more the soft skills, that it's underestimated how important or what you require require to really develop good participatory processes. Often we see in many kinds authorities, people who have a technical education are supposed to design participatory processes. So you would probably never allow someone who hasn't the proper training in technology to really engage, run a stakeholder process. The other thing happens, and then often things are screwed up. Building trust, really engaging people is something that requires also a lot of skill and expertise. And I think that is still underestimated, the kind, so not necessarily it's an art, but definitely a craft that also requires skill and expertise. And obviously it requires also a political will in order to empower really stakeholders, people, in order to bring their voice to the table.
Thank you. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about systems, our natural inclination is to have a predictability, tidiness, a system where one connects to the other, connects to the other. Whereas we all know that development is a messy business, right? It doesn't lend itself to tidiness. I'm going to ask the panel a general question. Do you think the more perfect the system we make, the more hazards we introduce in terms of the temptation to corruption, to subvert the system, to get by, because there is a barrier here and there's a control there and there's a system there, and somehow to try and duck and weave and make our way through the process? This is a general question. Do you want, Monsieur Launay, do you want to answer that? The minister can answer that.
In fact, it is not a matter of a perfect system. It is a matter of dynamic system that could adapt to the environment, to changing environment all the time. Some years you have extreme droughts, some other years you have extreme floods. So the way, the dynamics of the system that could be inclusive to everyone. I would put an example, how do we involve the farmers? When we talk about water issues and water scarcity, we publicize that. We teach, the public, students at school, at the churches, at the mosques. We give training of trainers at churches and in the mosques. And in the same time at schools, as well as we have the water ambassadors at schools. The students, how do they grow up and extend the water scarcity issue and water saving tools. So when we talk about rice cultivation is, rice is one of the crops that consume more water. So when we involved the parliament members and the Minister of Agriculture, and we talk to the farmers with the reality of the water stress situation in Egypt, then they responded and their action was very high. So the dynamics of the system is important more than to have, of course, all of us need perfect system, but should be dynamic and adaptable to any changes related to water.
Any other responses? Stefano?
Yes,
and then Claudia.
Actually, following up on the same, train of thought as the minister. If you think of it, I can think again, from a legal regulatory perspective, the perfect system. You put in place a system for controlling abstractions of water from, whatever natural system, a river, a lake, or from groundwater. That is the standard perfect in brackets, in quote unquote, regulatory response to the issue of, managing a scarce resource. So you control access by a permit system. Now, you can also think, a permit system is the perfect opportunity to induce the kind of behaviors that you alluded to. So trying to flout the system, so it could be an inducement to corruption, so that, you circumvent, the system, the perfection, that you put in place. Now, there is obviously, this is natural, perhaps, in the human behavior. But the answer to that, I would have thought, and I should think, is, as the minister alluded and explained, is engaging with the intended regulated user population. So through a process of engagement with them, education, awareness raising, why are those controls in place? There is a reason for that. It's not just to, to assert, the authority of government as an end in itself. There is a purpose for that. There is a reason behind that. So engaging, education, outreaching, that has to go with a perfect, if you like, system, legal system response to the issues ahead.
Thank you. Claudia, will you hold your fire for a sec? Because I just want to ask the audience, we haven't invited them into this discourse. We have about 11.5 minutes left. So do you have any particular questions to ask any member of the audience, or do you have a point to make, but it has to be extremely brief? Anybody? Yes, madam. You'll have to wait for a mic. There is a mic there, which is coming to you from your right.
Thanks. Janet Herring-Elvag. I have a question for Claudia, and that has to do with the idea of this community of practice, which I think is a great idea. There also seem to be a lot of organizations and associations and groups that are springing up with very much parallel interests and activities. And I'm wondering what you see as the opportunity to bring those groups together so that they can build off each other's strengths and not unnecessarily duplicate their efforts.
Claudia?
Yes,
if you can weave the earlier one into that.
Yes, perhaps just responding first to Janet's question. Yeah, for example, the OECD Water Governance Initiative is one. When I talk about a community of practice in this field, it's mainly on governance issues. The big question is already who would fund such an international activity in order to bring these kind of people together. And we currently, I think there are opportunities. We are in discussion with a couple of people, as I said, the OECD Water Governance Initiative, the implementation process for SDG 651. We also try to link it to under the umbrella of the Sustainable Water Future program in order to, and community of practice would mean that we would not only talk, but for example, look at the various indicators that are developed to really say, how can we bring this together? For example, have certain pilot studies where we really can combine these various attempts to look at governance indicators, diagnostic approaches, and implement them. So there is, I think, willingness and opportunities. I don't yet see the appropriate context of structure, network structure, where this could be embedded, in particular also in order to get certain kind of financial support. That's always where there is some kind of bottleneck, but we currently try to do that, and often it could be, for example, the government that might support this. The previous questions I wanted still to address a bit this perfect system. I entirely support the arguments by the prior speakers. What perfect. I'm coming more from complex systems. Perfect is system hardly ever is perfect. It's perhaps robust against changes. I would also support that we need more adaptive, flexible system. But somehow these governance systems, so there's always a trade-off between too dynamic and providing also some stability, because part of rules governance system, they also should provide stability for a certain kind of that expectations, like the renewable energy law. It was designed for 10 years in order to really guide these kind of expectations for investors. So on one hand, we need really to say what are kind of appropriate processes that we need to put in place in order to also have to revise, for example, certain practices. And so these processes need to engage users, they need to be transparent, open, because often a critique against adaptive management is, right, who adapts, to which would it be just the powerful who would say, we go in this or that direction. Again, I think we need appropriate processes that build on insights, scientific knowledge, to say, all right, where are we? And do we still have the appropriate goals? Are the measures in place really leading us to where we want to go to, or do we have to change? Again, a strong emphasis on inclusive, transparent processes, also building on the best available scientific evidence to reflect on whether the appropriate means, the current processes in place are the right ones and where one has to change. And the final comment, I think in the end, in my ideal world, we really would move to an integrated landscape management approach to govern landscapes rather than individual resources. But that is a bit of I guess, would take a few further Budapest water summits until we might report progress on that. But that would be probably where we should aspire to.
Any other questions? We've got just about 7 minutes left. Yes, Tony? A mic's coming to you from your right.
Tony Slatcher from the Water Policy Group. Great session, really great session. But this last issue around the risk that regulatory and allocation systems can motivate bad behaviour. The alternative, of course, is the tragedy of the commons, and what we've seen occur when there are no rules and resources are depleted and poisoned, and everybody is worse off. I think we have to think about, and we have had experience in the world, with what is the appropriate form of regulation, and that builds trust within communities and between neighbours, so that in the absence of these rules, what we've seen is that people don't trust their neighbours not to steal or pollute or overuse water. So some kind of regulatory framework is essential to guard against that. But I'm just interested in the panel's thinking on, how do you strike the right balance here?
So are you saying, Tony, it's better to have regulated risk rather than unregulated chaos?
Yes. Okay. In water with a precious and valued resource, right. Absolutely yes.
Okay. I'm going to... Eddie, did you want to make a point?
If I may, I think I agree that you need regulations, but what I also see is that the thresholds that are sometimes identified in those regulations, that they are under pressure and that they change. So I think if you want to have this adaptive approach in your regulations, you should maybe also think about how you can change then those thresholds. But at the same time, because I think Claudia was also referring to the problems that the farmers have in Germany, in the Netherlands as well, with the nitrate laws, is if those thresholds change, you should also realize that you are going to hit a group in the populations. And I think we don't have a clear process there how to engage with them before something like that happens, which causes quite an unrest.
Okay, now here's an exercise. I'm going to ask the panel whether they think for implementation the right systems are in place. And then I'm going to ask the audience the same question. So the panel, do you think the right systems are in place for implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals? Please raise your hands if you think that they are in place. We have one member of the panel. Any in the audience, do you think the right systems are in place? No, you have one. So there is some convergence there. Now I'm going to ask, can they be in place? Which is a different question. Can they be in place? Yeah, go on. Any, members of the panel, can they be in place? Can you raise your hands whether the systems be in place if you do the right things? Okay, so more members of the panel. Audience, can the right systems be in place? Okay, so there's some hope for the world. Very good, very good. Okay, excellent. So here's the thing, to go back to what Mr. Vinci Guerra was talking about, the spiritual content. You know that the three-stage development rocket, the fuel, I had thought, was informed public opinion. Informed public opinion, proper informed. But perhaps we should say informed and enlightened public opinion, because that introduces the concept of solidarity. We've got 2 minutes, 50 seconds left. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, madam.
Hello, it's Amanda Lufin from Waterlex. In response to the question of why should we care by Dr. Vinci Guerra, I also caution our concentration on 6.5 in terms of the consultation, and I request that we consider the human rights to water more integrated in all of the processes, because it keeps the focus on people as well as the environment and the other water resource management issues. And I just wondered if there might be any comments on that.
Okay. Was that a question or a comment?
Both. I'm just requesting if there's any thoughts on that.
It'll have to be very quick because we have just 2 minutes left.
Thank you very much. Extremely quickly. Usually, the Holy See has been insisting on the need of legal structure. So beyond voluntary guidelines, how and if states are accountable for this right. And according to many international law experts, so far the human right to water, drinking water and sanitation is quite weak as far as the international architecture is concerned. About the challenge of the perfect system, very briefly, technology can help, not only early warning system before floods, but even simply to fight against corruption. Always insist on humans, so training, but also dialogue, time for dialogue, and as I said, education. And also when we mention nature-based solutions, let's be humble. What are we really ready to learn from nature? Okay, water has to be among the top priorities. We all agreed in many fora, in many days. But let's also share the burden of water with others. What about marketing, aggressive promotion of throwaway culture? What about the other pillars of economy, of marketing, of overconsumption? Can they help somehow the water agenda? And say this kind of economics, this business plan, this way of life is unhealthy, unsustainable, unfair.
Thank you. Okay, we're coming to the end of the session, and the clock's going to defeat us. So here's the thing. What we didn't discuss is what Mr. Vinci Guerra was talking about, traditional systems. Let's not call it indigenous systems, traditional systems, because we are born and live in the world of regulations and systems. And the old doesn't need to be just discarded just because it's old. We need a lot to learn from traditional practices and systems. So that's a lesson for us. I'd like you to join me in thanking the panel and the keynote speakers for their wisdom and for their insights. And I'd like you to join me in thanking yourselves for being such a patient and engaged audience. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for the moderation and for the panel members for their valuable discussion.